Picture this. War machines so technologically advanced and devastatingly powerful that they could obliterate any opposing armored vehicle on the battlefield, yet simultaneously so resource-intensive and expensive that their very existence drained vital supplies from the broader military effort. This is the central paradox that haunted Nazi Germany's armored forces during the Second World War. Could it be that Adolf Hitler's fixation on creating ever more powerful supertanks actually sealed the fate of his soldiers long before they ever engaged the enemy? The answer to this question might fundamentally reshape your understanding of how World War II unfolded. When we think back to the machines that emerged from the Second World War, few capture the imagination quite like Germany's heavy tanks. The Tiger and the Panther stand as towering figures in military history, their distinctive silhouettes etched into our collective memory. Those elongated gun barrels reaching forward like accusing fingers, the thick plates of sloped armor deflecting incoming fire, the ominous shapes prowling through devastated urban landscapes or across frozen Eastern European plains. These vehicles transcended their mechanical nature to become something more. They were transformed into legends, representing the pinnacle of German industrial might and technological prowess. For those who stood against them, these tanks embodied pure terror on treads. Allied infantrymen and tank crews who witnessed a Tiger emerging on the distant horizon often felt their resolve waver, their courage tested by the mere appearance of these formidable machines. In our modern era, these tanks continue to fascinate, remaining powerful symbols of engineering achievement and wartime innovation. Museums display them prominently. Video games feature them as elite units, and documentaries examine them with reverent detail. Yet beneath this legendary status lurks a profound and troubling question that strikes at the fundamental strategy of Germany's entire war effort. Did these technological achievements actually contribute to Germany's ability to wage a war it might conceivably win? Or did the pursuit of these armoured behemoths guarantee Germany's eventual defeat from the moment the first design blueprints were approved? This isn't a straightforward question with an easy answer. The complexity of the issue reveals itself when we examine the situation from multiple angles. On one hand, the Tiger and Panther tanks delivered firepower capabilities that exceeded virtually every Allied tank they encountered. These machines could engage and destroy American Sherman tanks or Soviet T-34s at distances where those enemy vehicles couldn't even hope to return effective fire. The psychological impact of these tanks appearing in battle reports was nearly as devastating as the physical damage inflicted by their shells. Allied commanders learned to fear them, and frontline troops dreaded encountering them. Yet this impressive combat performance came with crushing costs. These tanks were extraordinarily heavy, mechanically complex, and demanding in every conceivable way. Each Tiger tank required many months to manufacture, consumed rare strategic materials that Germany could barely afford to spare, burned through fuel at alarming rates in a nation perpetually short of petroleum, and demanded dedicated maintenance teams that followed these vehicles wherever they went. A mechanical breakdown, which occurred with distressing frequency, could remove a Tiger from combat just as effectively as a direct hit from enemy fire. The arithmetic was brutal. For every single Tiger tank prowling the front lines of the war, the Soviet Union could manufacture and deploy dozens upon dozens of T-34 tanks. The Americans, drawing on their vast industrial capacity, could produce countless Sherman tanks for the same investment of resources. This fundamental tension between quality and quantity creates one of World War II's most compelling alternative history scenarios. What if Germany had made different choices? What if, rather than pouring enormous resources into these apex predators of the battlefield, the German High Command had instead committed to mass-producing simpler, more reliable tank designs? Vehicles like the Panzer IV medium tank and the Stu-G3 assault gun lacked the glamorous reputation of the big cats, but they could be manufactured quickly, repaired relatively easily with commonly available parts, and most importantly, deployed in numbers that might have genuinely affected the war's outcome. Could an armoured force built around reliable workhorses have held back the massive waves of Allied armour more effectively than a handful of technological showpieces ever could? Those who defend the decision to develop heavy tanks argue passionately that Germany absolutely needed these vehicles to counter the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 heavy tanks in the summer of 1941. Without this leap in design philosophy and capability, they insist, German armour would have become obsolete virtually overnight, unable to compete with Soviet designs. However, critics of this decision counter that by chasing technological superiority at all costs, Germany effectively trapped itself in a strategic approach it could never sustain over the long term. German factories, already operating under severe strain, produced fewer total tanks. German armies, perpetually short of fuel, now had to feed the most fuel-hungry engines deployed anywhere in the war. Each Tiger lost in combat represented far more than just a destroyed tank. It represented months of irreplaceable industrial effort, skilled labour, and strategic materials gone forever. The debate continues to this day among historians, military analysts, and World War II enthusiasts. Were the Tiger and Panther tactical masterpieces that arrived too late in the war to save Germany from defeat? Or were they strategic miscalculations that virtually guaranteed German defeat by misallocating scarce resources? As we examine this story in detail, we find ourselves standing at one of history's great crossroads, where design philosophy, military strategy, and national survival collided with devastating consequences. The question that echoes through the decades remains hauntingly relevant. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of total industrial warfare, does it make more sense to construct fewer masterpieces of engineering or to flood the battlefield with thousands of machines that are merely good enough? When the European War ignited in September 1939, German armoured strategy wasn't built on massive steel monsters or technological supremacy. Instead, it relied on mobility, careful coordination between different military branches, and having sufficient numbers of tanks to execute combined arms operations. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, which would later be considered light and medium designs by comparison to what followed, formed the essential backbone of what became known as Blitzkrieg. Their guns weren't particularly impressive, their armour protection was relatively thin, but these tanks operated as integrated parts of a larger system that included infantry support, artillery bombardment, and close air support from the Luftwaffe. In the campaigns against Poland, France, and throughout the Balkans, this combined arms formula proved devastatingly effective. German tanks during these early campaigns weren't individually superior to many of their opponents in terms of armour protection or firepower. What made them effective was how they were deployed as components of a comprehensive system emphasizing speed, aggression, and tactical flexibility. However, by the summer of 1941, this successful system encountered challenges it was never designed to overcome. Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, began with tremendous confidence throughout the German High Command. The Wehrmacht expected another swift campaign, another demonstration of blitzkrieg superiority. Instead, across the fields of Belarus and Ukraine, German tank crews found themselves confronting shapes and silhouettes they had never encountered before, machines that challenged everything they thought they knew about armoured warfare. Soviet T-34 tanks, featuring revolutionary sloped armour that increased protection without adding weight and wide tracks that distributed ground pressure for better mobility, absorbed hits that by all rights should have destroyed them outright. The KV-1 heavy tanks lumbered onto battlefields seemingly impervious to most German weapons. For the first time in the war, experienced German tank crews fired their guns at enemy vehicles and watched in disbelief as their shells bounced harmlessly away, leaving barely a scratch on Soviet armour. The psychological shock rippled through the ranks. The inadequacy of German anti-tank weaponry became painfully, undeniably clear. The standard 37mm anti-tank gun, which German soldiers mockingly nicknamed the door knocker because it seemed to merely announce your presence rather than penetrate enemy armour, could barely scratch Soviet tanks even at point-blank range. The upgraded 50mm guns that had seemed adequate in France fared only marginally better against these new Soviet designs. Even the Panzer IV, equipped with its short-barreled 75mm gun originally intended for infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat, found itself dangerously outclassed when facing the T-34. Reports flowed back to Berlin describing hopeless duels where entire panzer companies proved unable to stop Soviet armoured breakthroughs, where German tactical superiority meant nothing against vehicles their weapons couldn't harm. For an army that had grown accustomed to dominance, this represented a psychological blow of immense proportions. Survival demanded improvisation. German units in the field began pressing captured Soviet 76mm guns into emergency service, mounting them on makeshift carriages or converting light tank chassis into fragile but effective tank destroyers. New weapons like the 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun were rushed into production and deployment, but developing and manufacturing these solutions required time. In 1941, time was precisely the resource Germany lacked. Every month that passed allowed the Red Army to recover from initial defeats, rebuild its shattered units, and field more T-34 tanks, while German factories strained desperately to keep pace with losses and the demands of multiple fronts. This crisis sparked urgent, sometimes heated debates within the German High Command and among senior military planners. Was it sufficient to improve existing tank designs, pushing the Panzer III and Panzer IV to their absolute performance limits? Or did the Reich require an entirely new generation of armoured vehicles that would be heavier, more powerful, and more heavily armoured than anything yet constructed by any nation? Some commanders argued pragmatically for practicality over perfection. More Panzer IV tanks, they suggested, equipped with longer, more powerful guns, could adequately meet the Soviet challenge without requiring a complete overhaul of production facilities and logistics systems. Others believed passionately that only a revolutionary leap in capability could restore German superiority on the battlefield. In the background of these strategic debates loomed the larger, more ominous reality of Germany's resource constraints. Germany in late 1941 was already stretched dangerously thin across multiple fronts and commitments. Oil supplies were severely limited, with Germany never achieving self-sufficiency in petroleum production. Steel and other strategic materials had to be carefully rationed between competing demands. Tanks, aircraft, naval vessels, artillery pieces, and countless other weapons systems. German factories, though efficient, were increasingly vulnerable to Allied air raids that would only intensify as the war continued. Every decision to allocate resources to one project inevitably meant denying those resources to something else. The constant trade-offs created a zero-sum game where there were no perfect solutions. Meanwhile, across the battle lines, the Soviet approach to armoured warfare stood in stark contrast to German thinking. The T-34 wasn't designed to be perfect or to achieve technological superiority. It was designed to be simple enough for hastily trained crews to operate, reliable enough to function in the harsh Russian climate, and most importantly, cheap enough to produce in enormous numbers. Soviet factories, many of which had been relocated far beyond the Ural Mountains to escape German bombing, operated around the clock with workers performing brutal shifts. The Red Army could afford to lose tanks in staggering numbers because replacement vehicles were always streaming off production lines. Germany, with its far more limited industrial capacity and smaller population, faced the opposite reality. Every tank lost represented a blow that couldn't easily be repaired, a gap that couldn't quickly be filled. This fundamental imbalance between the competing philosophies of quantity versus quality set the stage for all the decisions that followed. The Tiger and Panther weren't conceived as prestige projects or symbols of German engineering pride, at least not initially. They emerged as responses to a genuine crisis, desperate attempts to solve problems that threatened Germany's entire Eastern Front strategy. The Wehrmacht had discovered through bitter experience that its tried-and-true formula for success no longer worked effectively. Against massed Soviet armor supported by artillery and increasing numbers of aircraft, German tanks needed either overwhelming numerical superiority or overwhelming individual superiority. Achieving numerical superiority was impossible given Germany's industrial limitations. Individual superiority through technological advancement became the only viable option remaining. Therefore, the historical background that led to the Tiger and Panther wasn't one of triumph or confident expansion. It was shaped by desperation, by the recognition that German forces faced an existential threat. These heavy tanks were conceived in the crucible of Operation Barbarossa, during those terrible months when the myth of German invincibility shattered against the reality of Soviet resilience and industrial capacity. They represented attempted answers to problems revealed brutally on the frozen steppes: the failure of small-caliber guns to penetrate enemy armor, the futility of thin armor protection against increasingly powerful Soviet weapons, and the terrifying realization that Germany's opponents could outproduce the Reich by factors that made long-term victory nearly impossible through conventional means. This moment in late 1941 and early 1942, when German officers first confronted the sloped armour of the T-34 and the seemingly immovable bulk of the K-1, represented a genuine turning point in German strategic thinking. It forced Germany's leadership to choose a path forward, to make fundamental decisions about how to proceed. The options were stark: adapt by producing many more practical, proven tank designs in greater numbers, or gamble everything on developing a new breed of armoured giants that might achieve through quality what couldn't be achieved through quantity. In that critical choice lay the origins of both the Tiger and the Panther, and simultaneously the seeds of a debate that continues reverberating through military history to this day. The Tiger and Panther tanks didn't simply appear from nowhere, materializing on battlefields without context or cause. They were born from genuine crisis, from strategic necessity rather than mere ambition. In June 1941, when German military forces launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, they anticipated rapid victory based on their previous successes. Instead, they encountered developments that would shock the Wehrmacht to its core. The Soviet Union fielded armoured vehicles unlike anything German forces had previously faced in Poland, France, or North Africa. The T-34 medium tank, with its innovative sloped armour that increased effective protection and its powerful 76mm gun, could shrug off direct hits that would shatter German shells against its hull. The KV-1 heavy tank, massive and seemingly immovable, defied nearly every anti-tank weapon in the entire German arsenal. Suddenly, almost overnight, the Panzer III and the early models of the Panzer IV, which had carried Germany to spectacular triumph in France just a year earlier, looked fragile and completely obsolete. German anti-tank doctrine, carefully developed over years of planning and previous combat experience, cracked under this unexpected pressure. The standard 37mm anti-tank gun proved essentially useless against Soviet armour in most combat situations. Even the 50mm upgrade, which had seemed adequate, failed with alarming regularity. Tank crews filed increasingly desperate reports describing shells bouncing harmlessly from T-34 armour even when fired at close range. For an army whose entire doctrine was built on speed, firepower and technological edge, this represented nothing short of a nightmare scenario. German engineers and military planners scrambled desperately for solutions to this crisis. They repurposed captured Soviet guns, mounting them on German vehicles. They stretched existing chassis designs to their absolute limits to mount larger, more powerful weapons. They accelerated development programs for weapons like the PaK-40 anti-tank gun, pushing factories to deliver new equipment faster than normal production schedules allowed. But all of these measures were stopgaps, temporary fixes that addressed symptoms without solving the underlying problem. What the German High Command wanted, what they believed they needed, was a definitive answer to the Soviet challenge. They wanted a tank that could restore German dominance on the battlefield through sheer superiority of design. The Tiger tank was intended to be exactly that answer. Ordered into production in 1942 after accelerated development, it embodied the philosophy of brute force married to technical sophistication. Its famous 88mm gun, derived from the equally famous anti-aircraft weapon, could destroy enemy armor at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Its armor protection, thick on every surface and especially formidable from the front, made it nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons when engaged from forward angles. On paper, examining its specifications, it represented everything German tank crews had desperately wished for during those terrible encounters with Soviet armor. On actual battlefields, it inspired genuine awe and fear in equal measure. Reports flowing back from the Eastern Front described Soviet units halting entire offensive operations when Tigers appeared on the battlefield. In the North African theatre, British troops learned to recognize and fear the Tiger's distinctive silhouette appearing through the desert haze. Yet this magnificent machine was simultaneously as much a burden as it was a blessing. Weighing over 50 tons, the Tiger strained Germany's already overtaxed logistics network to its absolute limits. Few bridges in Eastern Europe could safely bear its weight, forcing long detours or requiring extensive engineering work. Recovery from mechanical breakdowns, which occurred with distressing frequency, often demanded multiple recovery vehicles and specialized equipment. The Tiger's complex mechanical systems demanded constant, skilled attention, and spare parts were never available in sufficient quantities. Many Tiger tanks were lost not to enemy fire at all, but simply to mechanical failure in the field. Each Tiger that stalled on a muddy Russian road or froze solid during the brutal winter became a silent but eloquent reminder that theoretical perfection on engineering blueprints doesn't automatically guarantee practical success in actual combat conditions. The Panther tank, conceived somewhat later in the design process, was explicitly intended to represent a better balance between raw power and practical usability. Introduced to combat in 1943, it drew direct inspiration from the Soviet T-34, incorporating sloped armor, wide tracks for better mobility, and a long-barreled 75mm gun that offered excellent penetration characteristics. In many measurable ways, the Panther actually surpassed the Tiger. Its armor could deflect most Allied shells through a combination of thickness and slope, and its main gun could pierce even heavy Soviet tank designs at considerable ranges. Crucially, from a production standpoint, it was cheaper and faster to manufacture than the Tiger, though it still demanded far more resources and time than the older Panzer IV design. However, the combat debut of the Panther was marred by absolute disaster that revealed the dangers of rushing complex designs into production. At Kursk, which would become the largest tank battle in human history, brand new Panther tanks broke down in massive numbers before they could even properly engage the enemy. Engines caught fire spontaneously. Transmissions failed catastrophically. Out of nearly 200 Panthers deployed for this crucial offensive, barely half were operational when the actual battle began. For an army gambling everything on achieving a decisive blow that might turn the tide on the Eastern Front, such failures were absolutely catastrophic. The Panther eventually matured into one of the most formidable and effective tanks deployed by any nation during the entire war. But the cost of those early missteps, those teething problems that should have been resolved before deployment, was immense in terms of lost opportunities and squandered tactical advantage. Germany thus found itself locked between two competing visions of armoured warfare. The Tiger represented a heavy battering ram approach, a tank that struck fear into enemies but consumed resources at an alarming rate. The Panther embodied a more balanced predator philosophy that promised the possibility of mass production, but it arrived too late in the war and with too many initial flaws to fully deliver on that promise. Meanwhile, the workhorses of the German armoured force, the Panzer IV and the versatile Stu G3 assault gun, continued carrying most of the actual fighting load across all fronts. These medium designs, less glamorous than the big cats but far more practical in day-to-day operations, filled out the ranks of armoured divisions, while the Tigers and Panthers grabbed headlines and captured imaginations. Supporters of the heavy tank development program argued passionately that without these advanced designs, Germany would have been overrun much sooner than it actually was. They pointed to individual Tiger aces who claimed hundreds of enemy kills during their combat careers, and to defensive battles where a mere handful of big cats held off entire Soviet brigades through superior firepower and protection. Critics countered just as passionately that such victories were ultimately illusions, impressive in isolation but strategically meaningless. They argued that for every Tiger deployed in combat, dozens of simpler tanks could have been manufactured with the same resources. While one Panther might successfully destroy several T-34 tanks in a single engagement, it couldn't be everywhere at once, and numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm quality. This debate crystallized a deeper truth about Germany's strategic situation. Germany's industrial base, though modern and efficient, was fundamentally limited in absolute capacity. The nation could not afford to match the United States or the Soviet Union in sheer production numbers across all categories of weapons. By choosing to pursue the most technologically advanced tank designs possible, Germany placed its entire strategic bet on the proposition that quality could overcome quantity. But quality came with costs that mounted inexorably: time to develop and produce, fuel to operate, materials that grew increasingly scarce, and maintenance demands that pulled skilled technicians away from other duties. The Tiger and Panther were undeniable tactical marvels, but strategically they functioned as anchors tied to a nation already struggling to stay afloat in an ocean of Allied material superiority. When Tigers and Panthers finally rolled onto battlefields in substantial numbers, their fearsome reputations spread faster than their tracks could carry them across terrain. In the East, Soviet soldiers whispered about the Tiger's supposed invulnerability, trading stories that grew with each retelling. In the West, Allied tank crews exchanged increasingly nervous reports about Panthers lurking in Norman hedgerows or Italian hill towns. Wherever these machines appeared, they fundamentally changed the rhythm and character of battle. But reputation, however impressive, was only part of the larger story. The real questions that matter to history revolve around how these tanks actually performed in sustained combat, how they were deployed across different theatres, and how they compared to the more numerous Panzer IVs and Stu G3s that remained the genuine backbone of Germany's armoured forces throughout the war. On the Eastern Front, Tigers were typically organised into special heavy tank battalions and employed as a fire brigade force, rushed to sectors under the most severe threat. There, a small number of Tigers could blunt or even stop a Soviet advance, transforming columns of advancing T-34 tanks into fields of burning wrecks. After-action reports tell remarkable stories of individual Tiger crews destroying dozens of enemy tanks in single engagements that lasted mere hours. The Tiger's legendary 88mm gun outranged virtually everything the Red Army fielded until the introduction of the IS-2 heavy tank late in the war. Against infantry formations, the Tiger's thick armour made it nearly impossible to engage with portable weapons, forcing the Soviets to either swarm it with artillery fire or sacrifice men carrying explosive charges to its vulnerable flanks and rear. The Panther, though younger and less famous initially, quickly gained a similarly fearsome reputation once its mechanical problems were gradually resolved. Its long 75mm gun actually offered superior armour penetration characteristics compared to the Tiger's 88mm weapon. Combined with its sloped armour design that caused many Soviet shells to simply ricochet without penetrating, the Panther proved deadly in both offensive operations and defensive battles. Once the early mechanical issues were substantially reduced through design improvements, the Panther established itself as perhaps the most effective all-around tank Germany produced. In the defensive battles of 1944, particularly throughout the Baltic region and across Poland as Soviet forces drove westward, Panthers were regularly credited with achieving staggering kill ratios, sometimes destroying 10 or even 15 enemy tanks for each Panther lost in combat. Yet cold numbers tell a different, less encouraging tale for Germany. While Tigers and Panthers achieved impressive local dominance in specific engagements, they were simply too few in number to shift the outcomes of entire campaigns or affect strategic-level results. At Kursk, more than 1,000 Soviet tanks faced fewer than 300 German heavy and medium tanks in the decisive northern sector. The Panthers inflicted heavy casualties, but the Red Army could replace its losses within weeks through its massive production capacity. Germany could not hope to match this replacement rate. The tactical victories achieved by the big cats often evaporated strategically in the face of overwhelming Soviet reserves that could absorb losses and continue attacking. In Western Europe, the story followed similar patterns. During the Normandy campaign following the D-Day landings, Panthers represented Germany's most common frontline tank in many sectors. They proved decisively superior to the American Sherman tank in almost every direct head-to-head encounter between the two designs. Sherman crews quickly learned they often needed significant numerical advantage, artillery support, or airstrike coordination to successfully engage and destroy a Panther. But the Panther's very strengths created corresponding weaknesses. In the close, restrictive terrain of the bocage country with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, the Panther's long gun and heavy weight actually limited its tactical maneuverability. Mechanical breakdowns remained distressingly common even in the improved later models. German supply lines strained desperately to provide sufficient fuel and replacement parts to keep Panthers operational. The Allies, by stark contrast, could afford to lose Shermans in substantial numbers because replacement tanks were always available, shipped across the Atlantic in seemingly endless convoys. The Panzer IV and Stu G3, meanwhile, continued carrying the bulk of actual fighting across all theatres. By 1944, thousands of these vehicles remained in active service throughout German forces. The Panzer IV, though increasingly outclassed by newer Allied and Soviet designs, remained versatile and significantly easier to maintain in field conditions. The Stu G3, originally designed as an infantry support weapon rather than a dedicated tank, evolved into one of the most effective tank destroyers deployed by any nation during the entire war. Its low profile made it difficult to spot. Its frontal armour was surprisingly robust, and it was armed with the same long 75mm gun that made the late-model Panzer IV effective. Crucially, the Stug III was cheap to produce and destroyed countless Allied tanks at a fraction of the cost of manufacturing a Tiger. What emerges from careful examination of these comparative combat records is a fundamental paradox. The Tigers and Panthers achieved genuinely fearsome kill ratios in many engagements. In certain specific battles, a single Tiger platoon could effectively halt an entire Soviet regiment's advance. But the Panzer IV and Stu G3, though far less glamorous and less celebrated in popular imagination, were the true workhorses of German armoured forces. These vehicles were always present across every front, always fighting and, critically, always replaceable when lost. Germany's armoured capability depended on these unglamorous designs far more than it depended on the big cats that history remembers so vividly and discusses so frequently. The deployment patterns of heavy tanks also exposed fundamental limits in German strategy and operational planning. When concentrated in specific sectors, Tigers and Panthers could achieve brilliant local results. When dispersed too thinly across wide frontages, they became vulnerable, easily trapped by difficult terrain, fuel shortages, or inevitable mechanical failures. Unlike the Allies, who embraced quantity and operational mobility as core principles, Germany attempted to substitute quality for numerical strength. On actual battlefields, this meant that even when a Tiger or Panther completely dominated its immediate sector, the larger front often collapsed elsewhere, where no heavy tanks were present to stabilize the situation. Thus, the deployment of Tigers and Panthers functioned as a double-edged sword throughout the war. These tanks terrified enemies and dazzled commanders with their capabilities. They carved their permanent place in military legend through individual achievements and technical superiority. But they couldn't be everywhere simultaneously, and they couldn't be manufactured quickly enough to change fundamental strategic outcomes. In the final analysis, the big cats stalked through the war like phantoms, powerful beyond question, feared with good reason, but ultimately too rare and too demanding to alter history's tide flowing inexorably against Germany. What if Germany had chosen a completely different path? What if, instead of investing enormous resources in developing and producing tigers and panthers, the nation had poured that same industrial effort into manufacturing simpler machines in far greater numbers? Imagine thousands upon thousands of additional Panzer IVs and Stu G3s, supported by ample stockpiles of spare parts and benefiting from simplified logistics. Could such a fundamentally different decision have altered the war's trajectory in Germany's favour? On paper, when you examine the raw arithmetic, the alternative seems tempting. A single Tiger I consumed enough strategic materials, manufacturing time, and skilled labour to produce 3 or possibly 4 Panzer IV tanks. A Panther, though somewhat less resource-intensive than the Tiger, still demanded significantly more time and complexity than manufacturing the proven workhorses. Germany built just over 1,300 Tigers of all variants during the entire war and approximately 6,000 Panthers. By comparison, more than 8,000 Panzer IVs and over 10,000 Stu G3s rolled off German production lines. If every production slot allocated to Tigers and Panthers had instead been filled by medium tanks, the total numbers might have effectively doubled. Imagine the strategic implications of having 20,000 Panzer IVs and Stu G3s flooding the Eastern Front instead of the actual numbers deployed. Imagine German commanders never experiencing shortages of replacement tanks. Imagine Soviet armoured spearheads slowed not by scattered handfuls of Tigers, but by deep defensive belts composed of battalions of reliable medium tanks stretching from horizon to horizon. Could this alternative have been sufficient to blunt the Red Army's offensives? Perhaps it could have. The Panzer IV, especially in its later models equipped with the long 75mm gun, was genuinely capable of destroying T-34 tanks at respectable combat ranges. The Stu G3, with its low silhouette and strong frontal armour, was practically an ambusher's dream weapon. Deployed in genuine depth across defensive positions, these vehicles could have bled Soviet offensives white, trading machines 1 for 1, or sometimes achieving even better exchange rates, while ensuring that German formations never became hollow shells through unsustainable attrition. Yet the harsh reality of total industrial warfare resists such simple arithmetic calculations. Germany's fundamental problem extended far beyond just tank production numbers. The Reich faced critical shortages of fuel, trained pilots for the Luftwaffe, artillery pieces, trucks for logistics, and replacement crews for all weapons systems. By 1943, the Soviet Union and the United States were producing armoured vehicles at scales Germany could never hope to match regardless of which designs it prioritised. The Red Army built over 20,000 T-34 tanks in 1942 alone, a single year's production that exceeded Germany's entire tank output across all types. The Americans delivered more than 50,000 Sherman tanks by the war's end. Even if Germany had somehow managed to double its Panzer IV and Stu G3 production output, it still would have been outnumbered by ratios approaching 5 to 1 or perhaps even more. Quantity certainly mattered tremendously, but so did the overwhelming scale of the opponent's quantity advantage. There's also the critical matter of combat effectiveness to consider carefully. A Tiger tank in favourable conditions might destroy 10 or 15 T-34 tanks before being knocked out itself. Its exceptionally thick armour often made it completely immune to frontal attacks. A Panther, once its reliability improved, functioned as an even more efficient killer on the battlefield. If Germany had relied solely on Panzer IV tanks, could they possibly have matched such devastating battlefield dominance? Many serious historians argue that while the Tiger represented an extravagant expenditure of resources, the Panther actually struck an acceptable balance between capability and cost, proving superior to the T-34 without being quite as monstrously expensive as the Tiger. Abandoning the Panther development entirely might have meant ceding technical and tactical superiority to Soviet designs completely, with potentially serious consequences. Still, the what-if scenario continues to haunt historical analysis. What if Germany had accepted that it could never hope to win an arms race focused on technological extremes? What if, instead of building machines designed primarily to terrify and awe, German planners had focused exclusively on machines designed to endure and persist? Panzer IVs and Stu G3s could be manufactured in dispersed factories less vulnerable to concentrated bombing, repaired using fewer specialized resources, and operated by crews who could be trained more quickly than the specialists required for complex heavy tanks. Their combat losses could be more easily absorbed into the overall force structure, and their numbers could be sustained even as the war situation deteriorated. Such an approach might not have delivered ultimate victory, but it conceivably could have prolonged the war significantly, raised the blood price for Allied advances to levels that might have affected political calculations, and perhaps forced different negotiated settlements. Yet even this optimistic alternative scenario faces hard, immovable limits imposed by Germany's strategic situation. By 1944, Germany's critical oil fields in Romania were under sustained attack and would soon be lost. The skies above German railways increasingly belonged to Allied bombers that systematically destroyed transportation infrastructure. Tanks without adequate fuel supplies are not effective weapons at all. They become nothing more than stationary targets waiting for destruction. Without air superiority, without secure logistics networks spanning vast distances, no conceivable number of Panzer IV tanks could have fundamentally turned the tide flowing against Germany. The nation's eventual defeat wasn't solely about tank design philosophy. It resulted from the overwhelming industrial and material weight of enemies who could outproduce Germany across every category of warfare. And so this particular debate remains perpetually unresolved among historians and analysts. Some will always view the Tiger and Panther as fatal indulgences, expensive monuments to wasted effort and misplaced priorities that diverted resources from more practical needs. Others will insist equally passionately that these tanks were absolutely necessary responses to genuine Soviet threats, tactical marvels that at minimum delayed Germany's collapse and possibly prevented even earlier defeat. Both arguments contain substantial truth. What the what-if analysis really reveals isn't a single missed opportunity or clear alternative path, but rather the larger, more fundamental reality of modern industrialized warfare, that in conflicts fought by entire nations mobilizing their full resources, brilliance in individual design cannot overcome the brute force of mass production sustained over years. In the end, the question remains as haunting and unresolved as the legendary tanks themselves. Would thousands more Panzer IVs and Stu G3s have bought Germany more time to fight? Or would they too have been swept aside, eventually overwhelmed beneath the endless tide of Allied steel pouring from factories Germany could never match? The answer likely lies somewhere in the complex middle ground, where additional numbers might have mattered at the margins without changing the fundamental trajectory toward defeat. By the war's final years, the debate over quality versus quantity had moved beyond theoretical discussions in planning offices. It played out in the smoking ruins of shattered cities, in the churned mud of the Eastern Front's endless battlefields, and along the roads of France choked with destroyed vehicles. The Tiger and Panther had entered combat as promises of salvation, technological answers that might reverse Germany's deteriorating fortunes, but their legacy in actual practice was shaped as much by shortages and failures as by their undeniable triumphs in isolated engagements. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets demonstrated a remarkable and ultimately decisive ability to absorb catastrophic losses with seemingly inexhaustible reserves. A German Tiger battalion might destroy dozens of T-34 tanks in a single week of intense fighting. Yet within mere days, replacement tanks would pour westward from Soviet factories operating far beyond the Ural Mountains, well out of reach of German bombers. By 1944, Soviet production capacity dwarfed Germany's by margins that seemed almost incomprehensible. For every single Tiger that rolled off German production lines, the Soviets manufactured dozens of tanks to replace their losses. For every Panther, there were multiple T-34-85s, the improved variant with a more powerful 85mm gun. Germany's carefully engineered masterpieces won individual battles through superior performance, but they inexorably lost the larger war of industrial attrition. In Western Europe, the relentless Allied bombing campaign systematically crippled Germany's industrial infrastructure. Factories that produced complex components essential for Tigers and Panthers became prime targets for strategic bomber raids. Railway yards that transported engines and transmissions to assembly plants were methodically shattered. Even when completed tanks successfully left assembly lines, they often sat idle for extended periods due to fuel shortages or lack of transport capacity to move them to combat zones. German commanders increasingly faced the same bitter, demoralizing choice: abandon mechanically crippled vehicles that couldn't be recovered, or destroy them deliberately to prevent capture by advancing enemies. Photographs of burned-out Panther hulks littering the roads of Normandy became powerful emblems of an army in collapse, its technological sophistication meaningless without the logistics to support it. Meanwhile, the simpler vehicles continued their service. The Panzer IV remained in frontline combat until Germany's final surrender. The Stu G3, cheap to produce and efficient in combat, became the most produced armoured fighting vehicle in German military history. These workhorses fought across every theatre with grim effectiveness throughout the war. But even these practical designs couldn't escape the crushing reality of dwindling resources. By 1945, many German combat units had reverted to relying more heavily on horses than trucks for transportation. Even the most practical tanks imaginable cannot fight effectively without fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, and air cover to protect them from aerial attack. The aftermath of Germany's strategic choices reveals a deeper truth about the nature of modern warfare. By chasing technological superiority as a solution to numerical inferiority, the Reich fundamentally underestimated the true demands of total industrial war. The Tiger and Panther were genuine triumphs of engineering design and represented remarkable technical achievements. But they tied Germany's military fortunes to an economy already buckling dangerously under the combined weight of multi-front warfare and strategic bombing. Every mechanical breakdown, every armoured column stalled for lack of fuel, every abandoned wreck left behind during retreats symbolised the growing gap between theoretical vision and practical reality. What appeared as strength on engineering blueprints became operational weakness in practice because these magnificent machines consumed resources Germany could not afford to spare: time for production, materials growing increasingly scarce, and the operational mobility necessary for modern warfare. For the Allied powers watching Germany's struggles, the lessons appeared clear and validated their own approaches. They had embraced what might be called the principle of good enough. The American Sherman wasn't the best tank in terms of armour protection or main gun performance. The Soviet T-34 wasn't invincible against German weapons, but these designs could be manufactured in truly colossal numbers, shipped across vast oceans or continental distances, and repaired relatively easily in field conditions by moderately trained crews. They fought as integrated components of a machine of total war that included massed artillery, overwhelming air power, and seemingly endless supply chains. It was this integration, this binding of adequate quality to overwhelming quantity and reliable logistics, that ultimately overwhelmed Germany's strategic reliance on technological quality alone. By 1945, the legendary Big Cats were mere shadows of their former fearsome glory. A Tiger II, theoretically the king of any battlefield, often sat stranded without fuel, waiting helplessly for enemy fire or advancing infantry. Panthers fought with desperate ferocity during the Ardennes offensive, Germany's last major attack in the West, but many broke down before ever reaching the front lines due to mechanical failures exacerbated by hasty production and inadequate testing. The dreams of achieving decisive superiority through technology had transformed into nightmares of wasted effort and squandered resources. For Germany, the aftermath of its armoured gamble manifested as a slow, grinding, inevitable collapse. In historical hindsight, this story transcends the specifics of tanks and technology. It's fundamentally about choices made under extreme pressure, in the fog of war, with incomplete information about what the future would demand. The Tiger and Panther reflected Germany's desperate belief in decisive weapons, machines so powerful they might somehow reverse the tide of numerical inferiority. But the Second World War wasn't ultimately decided by individual tank versus tank duels, however dramatic. It was decided by the capacity to sustain fighting across entire continents, year after grinding year, replacing losses faster than enemies could inflict them. Thus, the aftermath leaves us confronting a stark paradox. The Tiger and Panther remain celebrated as engineering marvels, and justifiably so. They terrified enemies, inspired their own crews, and achieved combat feats that few other machines in history could match. But strategically, they became symbols of a fatal miscalculation. In chasing the extraordinary and remarkable, Germany neglected the ordinary and reliable. And in total industrial war, it was the ordinary, the countless Shermans and endless T-34s, that proved unstoppable through sheer weight of numbers. The Tiger and Panther outlived the Third Reich that created them. Though German armies lay in ruins by May 1945, these tanks endured as powerful symbols, remembered, endlessly debated, and thoroughly mythologized long after the last shot was fired. Their legacy isn't measured solely in steel and armor plate, but in the stories and controversies they continue to generate decades later. To many people, they remain the most iconic tanks of the entire Second World War. Museums around the world still preserve surviving examples, drawing crowds who marvel at their impressive size and sophisticated design. Popular culture, including films, television documentaries, and video games, has kept their distinctive silhouettes alive in public consciousness. A Tiger tank rumbling across a screen instantly conveys menace and overwhelming power. A Panther cresting a ridge signals deadly precision and technical superiority. In collective memory, they transcended their mechanical nature to become legends. Yet legends frequently obscure historical truth. The Tiger's reputation for virtual invincibility was built on isolated moments of brilliance and remarkable individual achievements, but its overall combat record was decidedly mixed. For every celebrated story of a Tiger ace destroying dozens of enemy tanks in a single engagement, there were countless others of machines abandoned due to mechanical failure, destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, or immobilized by terrain or fuel shortages. The Panther, often hailed as perhaps the best all-around tank Germany produced, carried this same fundamental duality. Technically brilliant and tactically superior, yet simultaneously hamstrung by complexity, production challenges, and chronic shortages. Their legacies, therefore, aren't simple stories of triumph. They function as cautionary tales about how weapons systems can inspire awe while simultaneously concealing strategic failure. Historians continue debating the fundamental what-if question. Some argue persistently that had Germany avoided the costly path of heavy tanks, it might have fielded sufficient numbers of Panzer IVs and Stu G3s to blunt the Allied tide more effectively. Others counter just as insistently that no conceivable number of medium tanks could have offset the combined industrial might of the United States and Soviet Union once both were fully mobilized. In this ongoing debate, the Tiger and Panther serve as focal points, standing in for larger questions about whether quality can ever truly outweigh quantity in wars between industrialized nations. For the Allied powers, the legacy proved instructive. The United States and Soviet Union observed Germany's obsession with technological superiority and drew precisely opposite conclusions. In modern industrialized warfare, they concluded, endurance and sustainability matter far more than perfection in individual platforms. The Sherman and T-34 were far from flawless designs, but they could be built, replaced, and supplied on scales the enemy could never hope to match through quality alone. Their legacy represents the inverse of the Tigers, a powerful reminder that good enough, when available in overwhelming numbers, can prove more decisive than the absolute best in limited quantities. The psychological impact of German heavy tanks also lingered long after the war ended. Soldiers who faced them in combat never forgot the experience. Entire Allied units described the visceral dread of hearing a Tiger's engine approaching or seeing a Panther's gun flash across an open field. That fear was genuine and deeply felt, and in certain ways it outlasted the war itself. Even decades after Germany's defeat, veterans spoke of the big cats with profound respect, sometimes even reluctant admiration. Their aura became a permanent part of Wehrmacht mythology, an image that still colours public imagination and shapes how the German military is remembered. But perhaps the most important legacy is what these tanks reveal about the fundamental nature of total war. The Tiger and Panther demonstrate how a nation's pursuit of technological excellence can become its own undoing when divorced from realistic strategy and resource availability. They remind us that wars between modern nations are not won by individual weapons platforms, however technologically advanced. Victory requires complete systems, functioning factories, secure supply lines, robust logistics networks, effective training programs, and sustained political will. The Allied powers understood this systemic reality. Germany, for all its undeniable brilliance in engineering and design, failed to fully grasp it until too late. Today, when visitors stand before a surviving Tiger or Panther in a museum, the impression remains undeniably powerful. These machines tower over other tanks from the era, massive and intimidating even in silent display. But their museum presence also carries an important lesson for those willing to consider it. These were machines explicitly built to win tactical battles through superior performance, yet they lost the strategic war. They embody simultaneously the remarkable genius of German engineering and the critical blindness of German grand strategy. They stand as relics of both tremendous power and ultimate failure. In the final measure, the legacy of the Tiger and Panther is fundamentally twofold and contradictory. They are rightfully celebrated as masterpieces of armoured warfare, genuinely admired for their sophisticated design and fearsome battlefield prowess. But they are equally remembered as monuments to a deeply flawed vision, one that desperately sought salvation in quality when only quantity could have delivered even the possibility of survival. Their story transcends tanks and technology. It's about the choices nations make under existential pressure, about the dangerous illusions of technological superiority, and about the unforgiving arithmetic of industrial warfare between fully mobilized societies. And so, long after the last Tiger rusted into the earth and the last Panther burned out on a forgotten battlefield, their shadows remain present in military history and strategic thinking. They endure as symbols of a truth that history never allows us to forget. In total war between industrial powers, brilliance without numbers is never sufficient. The Tiger roared with devastating effect. The Panther stalked its prey with lethal efficiency. But in the end, both were drowned beneath the thunder of countless ordinary machines that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed, produced by economies that could sustain losses Germany never could.